So I've got my 3D text, it's all working. I've scaled it up a little bit. And also, if I select that text layer and hit R, I get my rotation values. I just use the orientation just to adjust maybe the y-axis a little bit so it lines up with the camera a little better. Once it's aligned with my world, if I want to animate these settings further down the track, I'll use the individual X, Y, and Z values to animate it. I use the orientation just to set up the initial orientation of the text. So again, if I hit 0 on my keypad, this is looking pretty good. I've got my text floating up in the sky there next to the tree. I'm just actually going to scale my text down a little bit so it's not overlapping the tree. And I might just shift it a little bit to one side. And if I hit 0, that's looking pretty good. So this is already good. The track's looking good, it's looking pretty solid, and by solid I mean it looks like it locks onto the film footage. One thing you'll notice with my footage is that there is a little bit of sway and wobble, and when you get movement, especially slightly faster movement in camera footage, your footage will just motion blur a little bit. We don't have any motion blur at the moment on our text because it's just sitting there in our 3D space, being drawn very cleanly. But it's a good idea to turn on motion blur because it is a natural thing that happens. If I get to a couple of the frames on my footage, I can see, for example, on this frame right here, I don't know how well you can see on the projector, but the stairwell and the support pillar are just a little bit blurry there because around the edge of the camera they've moved quite a bit in this frame and there's just a little bit of motion blur. So motion blur is definitely happening in my footage, so I should put some on my text. So that's really easy to do. All we need to do is select our text down in our composition layers, go along these little row of icons. There is an icon that looks like a circle with a bunch of smaller circles behind it. That's representing a ball that's moving with motion blur behind it. So turn that little icon on for that layer. So that means that layer will now motion blur. Once you've done that, you need to turn on motion blur for your composition so it actually does do the motion blur effect. And that is this master switch here. It's the same icon but bigger. If we turn it on, it changes color. Now if you scrub through your footage to a point where there is a quick bit of motion, that's there for me. I'll just zoom in so you can see it. We can see there is definitely some motion blur going on. I can toggle that switch on and off. So that's no motion blur, some motion blur. So if I just preview that, so what will happen is our graphics that are in the scene, with that little bit of motion blur, they will match a little bit better the film footage because there will be some motion blur in the film footage. You can see in the background, the leaves and the trees and the trunk, they're all smeared a little bit horizontally as the camera's moved quickly. So that motion blur is really important. It really helps to sell the fact that our graphics are actually in the scene and sitting in a 3D space. Super handy. So that's looking really good. So I've positioned my text, it's rotated and aligned with the world, I've turned on motion blur, I've scaled it to what I want, so that's looking pretty good.